Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Erasing the Stigma. Today, I am here with Dr. Brock Eide. Would you be able to give listeners a snapshot of who you are and a little bit about your company, NeuroLearning?
Sure. For the last 20 years, my wife and I, who are both physicians, have been working primarily with individuals with learning differences. And for the last 15 years or so, we've really focused in specifically on dyslexia and language learning disabilities. And in the process, have published two books. One was called The Mislabeled Child, and the other, Dyslexic Advantage, which focuses specifically on dyslexia. We've also started a nonprofit organization that's called the Dyslexic Advantage that is specifically oriented to helping individuals with dyslexia understand both how to deal with some of the challenges of being dyslexic with learning to read and spell and write and do some of those other things, but also to emphasize the strengths that go along with dyslexia and to help individuals learn how to identify and build their personal strengths. And then finally, out of that, we also founded NeuroLearning SPC, a social purpose corporation, whose purpose is to create a dyslexia screening tool that allows individuals from age 7 all the way to age 70 to identify their risk for dyslexia or their likelihood of being dyslexic. And in addition to the screener for dyslexic challenges, it also has a strengths test, a mind strengths test, we call it, that allows individuals to see what strengths associated with dyslexia they have as well.
That is wonderful. The work that you and your wife have done is amazing. And specifically for neurolearning, I think that is fantastic that you guys screen people from the ages of 7 to 70 because there's a large group of adults who did not get screened for dyslexia when they're younger and they struggle throughout their whole life. And you make it available for them to get tested later in life and get the help that they should have gotten when they were younger. So I would like to ask you what prompted you and your wife to start the NeuroLearning Corporation?
Well, we've always felt that the biggest thing that we could do to help people with dyslexia was to help them understand uh, that the dyslexic mind is not a mind that's fundamentally impaired, but it's just oriented to doing different kinds of things in different kinds of ways. But the first step to being able to do that is to get people to understand that they are actually dyslexic and that they there's a reason that they find some things difficult and that there are probably some things that they are really good at that they haven't necessarily connected with their dyslexic kind of mind. And so we wanted to help people identify themselves as dyslexic and show them that this information would be relevant to them. Because, like you said, there's a lot of screeners now that focus on young children, identifying kids early on that might be at risk for dyslexia, but very few that focus on older people. And the vast majority of the dyslexic individuals out there whose lives are still being impacted by dyslexia are older than the 7 or 8 that most of the screeners stop testing after.
Yes. And so, as you've been mentioning, neurolearning really looks at your mind, and I find that extremely interesting. So, would you be able to explain to listeners that science behind neurolearning and the tests that users would take?
Yeah, so the traditional approach, especially in the United States, to thinking about dyslexia was that risk for dyslexic reading and spelling challenges really arose primarily from difficulties in the way that dyslexic people's minds process the sounds that occur in words. So problems with what's called phoneme awareness or the ability to distinguish between different sounds and words, and also phonological processing, the ability to take those different sounds that you identify in words and then be able to manipulate them and move them around and stack them together to make words or pull them apart and identify what the word structure is just by listening to it. And those things are certainly an important part of the contributory risks to dyslexic reading and spelling challenges. But over the last 20 years, both in Europe and in the United States, there's been an increasing recognition that other factors are important as well. And there's really at least 6 separate factors that can contribute to the risk of dyslexic reading and spelling challenges. So what we wanted to do with our test was to create a model of risk identification that was built on the collected risk from all of those factors. So we look at not only the ability to detect sounds and the ability to manipulate sounds, but also the ability to see and notice the difference between letters that are in tightly packed arrays. So the visual attention function. We look at working memory, which is the ability to hold things in mind, sound-based information primarily in this case, in mind while you're processing it and doing other things. We look at something called naming speed, which is the ability or the speed with which you can call verbal information out from your memory stores in response to a visual symbol. And of course, the one we're interested in is when people look at words and letters on a page, how quickly can you call them up? But even for people before they've reached the stage of reading, if you show them pictures of things, or if you show them colors and ask them to name and identify those pictures, you can measure the speed that they can do that, and that correlates with fluency that they'll be able to show in reading. So we test that also. And then we look at a couple of achievement skills. We look at how well people have learned to identify real existing words, and they can do that either by sight or by sounding out. And then we show them made up words or nonsense words that they have to identify purely by sounding out because they'll never have seen them before. And by comparing sight word and sounding out strategies, we can see where people are on the pathway of learning how to move from decoding and word recognition to kind of fluent reading. And then finally, we look at passage level reading. We give people paragraphs and ask them to read that and see if they can extract factual information from those paragraphs. And that gives us some idea of what their reading experience will be like in school when they're asked to read to learn. And finally, then we have a test that looks at vocabulary, which is kind of a stand-in measure for verbal ability in general that's been shown to correlate pretty well with your verbal knowledge and background knowledge and your ability to recognize words that you'll encounter in the text, because having better verbal skills and better vocabulary skills tends to make students a little bit more resilient to the impact of those low-level processing difficulties that I talked about with sound identification and visual attention and working memory. So when we put all of those together, it gives us a very complete picture, not only of the likelihood that individuals will have difficulty with reading and spelling, but what the sources of those difficulty are. And even beyond the dyslexic spectrum, it allows us to get a pretty good idea of whether individuals are having challenges with executive functioning or attention, so whether they might be also at risk for ADHD, which about 30 to 40% of dyslexic individuals are, and also whether they might have something that's a little bit more extensive on the language learning spectrum, like a developmental language problem that impacts the ability to learn things like word order in sentence or extract meaning out of sentences when you're reading them, and not just the ability to decode the words. So it gives a very complete picture of all the kinds of reasons that individuals can have for difficulty learning to read and spell.
Yes, that is an incredibly complete picture. And I think that's wonderful that you guys look at the whole picture. And I really appreciate you explaining that to me and my listeners, because there's such a connotation that dyslexia is just when people look at the words on the page, there's that common like notion that they might just flip their D's and their B's. And it's kind of thought of that's just it. And like you just explained, that's not it. And it affects people in so many aspects, almost all aspects of their lives. And I think that's wonderful, because then looking at the flip side of it, there's so many strains that people with dyslexia have that go in all aspects of their lives, that they can excel in many different fields and in many different careers. So I think that's wonderful that you guys identified that. And then also what you were saying with identifying whether someone might be at risk for ADHD or something else. And so, NeuroLearning, something that I find so amazing about it is that it is affordable. A lot of the dyslexia tests that other organizations or companies provide that are as extensive as your and your wife's tests are thousands of dollars. And NeuroLearning is $49.99 to get the test on the app. And you could get the mind test without paying for the test, if I'm saying that correctly.
That's right. You can do that for free just with a download of the app, which is free.
Right, which is incredible. So, on that note, because you make it affordable, you are making the dyslexia screening test accessible to people from low income households. However, let's say that someone from a low income household tests that they're either high or very high on the NeuroLearning scale, meaning that they most likely have dyslexia, or your test identifies that if they have dyslexia, they might be at risk for something else like ADHD. How would you advise someone coming from a low income household to proceed with this information for interventions? Because certain interventions for dyslexia and ADHD can be very expensive.
Yeah, that's definitely a big problem, and um, there are some solutions now, and a lot of them are local solutions. So I think step one is to hop on the internet and do a little bit of research, looking at things that might be available in your own community. And if you enter something like, the name of your town and dyslexia and free or reduced cost services or instruction, um, then there's a good chance that you may come up with some hits. So we work with a number of nonprofit groups in different areas around the country that many of which have been formed just in the last several years. And so they're fairly new, fairly not well known even in their own community, but starting to do really good work. So if you live especially in a larger city, work with groups in Baltimore and Houston and in Colorado and a number of other places. But in many places, you can find a group that will be interested in helping you. So there's been more federal dollars made available for support of students, especially in low-income areas, inner city areas. And so there are a lot of things that are available now. So that would be step one. Step two, even though it's not no cost, it's fairly low cost to do some of the newer online intervention programs. And for example, one in particular that we really like is called mindplay.com, which is mindplay.com. Um, and it's about $20 per month, which is not nothing, but it's less than the cost, really less than half the cost of a single tutoring session. And it's been shown by research to be quite effective for many students with dyslexia. So there are a couple others that we list in the resources section at NeuroLearning that offer similar services, but that would be one other place to start. And it's a little bit of a stretch for some people, but it's one of those things that's well worth the money if you can make it. And the final option is kind of a do-it-yourself approach. And this is intimidating for a lot of people, but there are good resources now that are available for fairly low cost that allow you to tutor your own child. And so that's the third and one of the least expensive options. And we try to list a few things also in the resources section at NeuroLearning about that. And I actually, take some grief for that from the purists and professionals who say, well, that's maybe not as good as what we can offer with tutoring, to which we simply point out that not everyone can afford your services. And for those who can't, we want to help them do the best job that they can. But even starting, at the $30 for a single book range, there are some interventions that can be very helpful for some kids. So that's the third option.
I think that is extremely helpful. And on the note of books, a great starting off point to learn more about dyslexia is a book that you wrote, which you mentioned in the beginning, which is The Dyslexic Advantage. Would you just be able to tell listeners a little bit about your book? And then also, would you be able to tell listeners what the two most important things that they should take away from your book?
Sure. Um, I think that our book really differs from other books on dyslexia because it asks a different question. So the primary focus of most books on dyslexia is kind of what's wrong with the way dyslexic minds work and how can you fix it or at least manage it. But we do something different. What we're really trying to ask is what are dyslexic minds for? What are they built to do? What kinds of things do they do well? What sort of strengths do they have? And how can you become the best you can be at being dyslexic? Um, so, if you want to know why so many people are dyslexic and why we think that that's actually a good thing, then our book is a good place to look. Uh, there was recently a paper that was published in a journal that's called Frontiers in Psychology that had received a lot of splash in the news, and some of your um, watchers may have seen that. And it was written by a young friend of ours who's a very brilliant dyslexic woman in the United Kingdom with a degree, a PhD in anthropology at Cambridge University, who teaches at Cambridge and also a university in Scotland. And her paper is built around the notion that dyslexic people are built to be complementary to non-dyslexic people in the sense that they fit together in a way that they create a complete partnership that's more powerful than either one separately, where people without dyslexia tend to be better at exploiting known resources. So at becoming very efficient at doing the same process over and over again and kind of moving incrementally forward from those processes and sort of building slowly. Whereas dyslexic people tend to be more exploratory in their way of thinking, and they're always looking for a new way to do things because they tend not to automate skills as well. They tend not to learn things by rote and repetition as easily as other people. And so they're always thinking their way through things. Well, the process of thinking your way through something all the time, whether it's seeing the word the on a different line of the page every time and having to sound it out each time, which is inconvenient, or whether it's being able to deal with some new problem when you're a 45-year-old person working in a company or a business somewhere and you encounter a new situation that you have to face that you've never faced before. Um, that kind of skill will have a very, or that kind of mental framework will have a very different look to you. In the one case where you're trying to do the same thing over and over again, it'll look very inconvenient. In the other case, where you've been practicing now for 40 years, thinking your way through things constantly, you suddenly find that you have strengths to do things in new and unusual situations that require creativity and new thinking. Um, that other people don't have because they haven't been forced to practice that so often. Uh,
Thank you so much for that. That is amazing. And the idea that people with dyslexia are like misshapen pieces of a puzzle, and that a lot of people think that they don't fit in this puzzle. But like you and your colleague was saying, that no, it's not that they don't fit, it's that they add to this picture and make a more beautiful picture. So I 1000% agree with that. And so, what about the two takeaways from your book that you think readers should take home with them?
Yeah, I think the first takeaway that we really think is central in the book is that dyslexic minds are not minds that are trying but failing to be like everybody else's, but they're really different for a reason, and that reason is to give them the ability to do things that other minds can't easily do, and to help create a complete human community. Um, Second, even though it's important to focus on fixing and improving some of the areas where you struggle, what we found is that over the span of a life, it's even more important to learn what you do well and to focus on building on your strengths and finding areas where you can use the special talents and abilities that you have to excel. So focus, don't while you're doing those extra studies and working on improving reading and all of those things, don't spend so much time doing that that you don't learn to develop your strengths as well.
I think that that is wonderful. And I really do recommend to all listeners to read The Dyslexic Advantage because it is a wonderful read. So I appreciate all of the advice and all of the insight that you have provided for me and my listeners. And the one question that I want to ask you to end it with is what is one thing you think that we can do to erase the stigma behind language-based learning disabilities?
I think the biggest thing that people can do is learn to become advocates and examples for the benefits of having these different kinds of minds. Um, the more you can understand what it is that you do special as a person with this different kind of learning and thinking approach, the more you can display that in your life and the more you can explain that to other people, the more other people will start to catch on. And I do think in general, we're really getting closer to a tipping point where more and more people are starting to realize that people with dyslexia and language learning differences really do bring something different to the table. And we're a little bit behind the United Kingdom because of the efforts of people like Richard Branson over there to publicize dyslexic strengths, and a woman named Kate Griggs who has a very good organization going over there. But we're starting to see over there that it's really kind of permeating the general consciousness of the population that if somebody's dyslexic, they probably have special gifts. Their kind of version of the National Security Agency actually hires people who are dyslexic specifically because they make better code breakers and puzzle breakers and problem solvers. And companies will specifically advertise for people with dyslexia to come and interview for jobs because they're recognized to have these special attributes of creativity and ability. So I think we're a few years away from that in the United States, but we're really seeing movements in that direction. And the more that everyone with dyslexia and language learning abilities learns to describe what it is that they're good at and what they can bring to being this extra piece that fits in and makes the perfect puzzle as you describe, then the more the stigma will just evaporate.
Yes, yes. And I agree with you. And I really am excited for the future to see more organizations coming through and advocating for the strengths of people with dyslexia. And I hope that listeners watching our conversations can take something away from this and in your own personal lives, use what you have learned from this conversation. And if you do read the book, The Dyslexic Advantage, and use that to advocate for people with dyslexia and their amazing strengths. So again, thank you so much for speaking with me today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Julia, and thanks for having me here.